Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, on this week's episode, I'm going to plunge myself headlong into controversy and deal with the issue of politics, most specifically the American presidential election, 2016. Obviously, anytime you start dealing with politics, perhaps even more than religion, you're going to draw out a lot of opinions and so forth. But really, this week I want to deal with a truly sober topic. And I want to discuss an issue that's very rarely discussed, although it is an issue which truly impacts politics in the United States. It's truly impacting Washington, and more than Washington. I mean, it truly affects so many things that take place in the United States and globally. And so, of course, it's important with regard to the coming political season, the coming election season. I want to jump into addressing the issue of the Saudi Arabian impact on Washington, its effect on the United States. And this is, as I said, it's an issue that is rarely discussed. It's discussed by very few, and yet this is one of the most significant, truly, defining factors within the American political system. I mean, far more, way more than most people realize. And so let's just go ahead. I want to begin with the birth of Saudi Arabia, the beginning of the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. What is it? So before the 1930s, the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, if you will, this is this, massive landmass that is to the southeast of Israel, just to the east of Africa, this massive peninsula. It was largely a group of divided tribes, very similar to the way it was when Muhammad came along. It was, all sorts of different tribes. Well, in the 1930s, a man named Muhammad ibn Saud, or Saud, he managed after some years of fighting, he managed to consolidate power over the majority of the Arabian Peninsula. He was just a desert Bedouin. He rose up, he became a leader, and he essentially conquered and sort of wrestled control over all these various other Bedouin tribes. And after doing that, he named the entire peninsula after himself and called it Saudi Arabia. Okay, so this was the beginning. This was the foundation of this new entity that had never existed before that. I mean, that whole west southern coast of Arabia was controlled by the Ottomans for 500 years until 1923-24, when the Ottoman Caliphate was abolished, and this is the Islamic form of government, was abolished. And then things sort of reverted to, just that wild tribal state. And then out of this period, emerges Muhammad ibn Saud and the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So the Ottoman Empire collapses. Muhammad ibn Saud establishes control over Saudi Arabia. And just a few years later, 1936 or so, they discover oil in what would become known as the largest, most significant string of oil fields to ever affect mankind, literally. I mean, the most significant, massive string of oil wells, primarily all along that whole east coast of Saudi Arabia, just sort of opposite Iran on the other side of the Persian Gulf. And this changed the world. Well, so shortly thereafter, a series of alliances were formed, corporate and governmental alliances between the United States. We sort of beat out England over being the first ones in there to make that connection with the Saudis. And there's these various alliances, these, as I said, governmental and corporate alliances between the United States and the House of Saud. And then out of this was formed an oil company, which became known as, well, the Arab American Oil Company, which became known as Aramco. Aramco, okay? So around the same time frame as all this is taking place, there was another man besides Muhammad ibn Saud who arose, and his name was Ibn al-Wahhab. And so Ibn al-Wahhab was a preacher. He was an Islamist thinker. And like so many other Islamist thinkers from this time frame, they were emerging and saying basically the reason the Islamic world is in such a mess, the reason it's not thriving as Europe is prospering and the Industrial Revolution, the reason the Islamic world is not sort of prospering, because Muslims are taught, the Quran teaches that they are the best of people, that they are divinely destined to rule the world. Islam's the best religion. They have the best prophet. They have the best holy book, all of these things. And so they look and they go, well, why are we not prospering the way that we think we should? And the Islamist thinkers always pretty much said, well, it's because we are not being devout enough with regard to Islam. And so Ibn al-Wahhab is the father of what is known as Wahhabism. And so as the kingdom of Saudi Arabia was being formed, there was this alliance on the religious side with Ibn al-Wahhab. And so since that time, Wahhabism and the House of Saud, they have essentially been one and the same. And so the kingdom of Saudi Arabia is not only the geographic womb, if you will, of Islam. I mean, Saudi Arabia today is the home to Mecca and Medina. This is where Muhammad's entire career was played out as he rose to become the prophet of this new religion called Islam. And it's also, Saudi Arabia today is also the home of Wahhabism. It's the primary support, it's the primary ideological womb, and as we'll see, also the primary financial support base for Wahhabism. And Wahhabism, sometimes it's called Salafism. It's sort of the most radical, purest form of Sunni Islam that we might imagine. So I said that Saudi Arabia is a significant supporter of Wahhabism. How do they do that? How does Saudi Arabia support radical Wahhabism, radical Sunni Islam? Well, the answer is in every way imaginable. So it's very simple. If there is a mosque, if there is an Islamic center, if there is an Islamic school in your neighborhood, if you live in the United States or really throughout the majority of the countries throughout the world, if there is a mosque in your city, there is a very solid chance, a high percentage that it was built and paid for by the Saudi Arabian government. Well, besides building the mosques, what else do? They train, and then they send out the missionary hate preachers, the imams, and then they fill the pulpits of these mosques, not all of them, but a large percentage. They fill the mosques with the Saudi Arabian sanctioned hate literature, the various literature which calls on Muslims, even here in the United States, to engage in jihad against the American Constitution, against the U.S. Constitution, against Israel, against the West. And so back in 2005, Freedom House did this big comprehensive survey of literature that was found in United States mosques, and they found numerous examples of calls to jihad, calls to all sorts of, excessive intolerance and hatred, and they all had the Saudi Arabian government seal of approval in the books. Okay, so this is not, this is not conspiracy theory. These are human rights organizations that did a very thorough study and showed that, yes, the Saudis are funding, paying for, printing, and then filling the mosques with the radical literature. So, these are just some of the basic things. The madrasas all over Pakistan paid and funded by the Saudis. And so, picture a complete evangelistic program from, if you were to use Christian language, they're building churches, they're sending missionaries, they're sending the literature, and they are raising up an entire global generation of Salafis, of Wahhabis, of some of the most extreme Sunni, some of the most extremist types of Muslims that are out there. It's not to say that all Salafis are radical jihadists. That wouldn't be fair. However, if you look at the vast majority of the jihadists that are out there, they are Salafis, they are Wahhabis. Whether we're dealing with Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda, which of course is global, or whether we're dealing with the Taliban, primarily in Afghanistan, whether we're dealing with ISIS, right? ISIS is active in Syria, in Iraq, in the Sinai Peninsula. They pretty much control Libya now. They're popping up all over the world, You know, these are all Salafi groups. These are all groups that find their ideological foundations in Saudi Arabia. Jabhat al-Nusra, again, a branch of Al-Qaeda in Syria, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Lashkar-i-Taiba in Pakistan, another radical Salafi group, wreaking havoc over there. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria. These are all Salafis. Listen to me, if it was not for Saudi Arabia, Ibn al-Wahhab, these groups wouldn't exist. Pretty much most of the radical Sunni groups that you can mention, they have their ideological and financial foundations in Saudi Arabia. Okay, now listen to this, because this is huge. This is not just some random commentator. This is the former U.S. CIA director, okay? This is the former director of the CIA, James Woolsey. And in 2005, he testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Government Reform. And this is the statement that he said. He said some $85 to $90 billion has been spent from sources in Saudi Arabia in the past 30 years, spreading Wahhabi beliefs throughout the world. Okay, now, again, we hear these numbers, our head spins. This statement was made in 2005, so that's 11 years ago. And so at that rate, and more than a decade has gone by since then, and at the rate that they were spending roughly $30 billion every decade. Now, since that time, they've probably spent another $30 billion. So let's say that we're at roughly $120 billion over the past 40 years. $120 billion. Now, to put this in perspective, please stop and listen to this. The Southern Baptist Convention International Mission Board is one of the largest Protestant mission sending organizations in the history of mankind, in the world, the IMB. They're one of the biggest. You've also got Wycliffe, YWAM, Assembly of God. These are probably the biggest four. I don't know exactly what their annual budget is. The IMB, their annual budget right now is roughly $300 million. So let's just say you combine them all, and I don't think the other ones are nearly as well funded, but let's just say they are. That would mean roughly $1.2 billion is spent by Protestants every year on global missions. $1.2 billion. Now that's per year. Now multiply that times 100, and that's how much the Saudis have spent over the past 40 years. Okay, so at these rates, the Saudis have been spending the total amount of what all of the other Protestants are spending on missions, and they're spending that amount roughly every month for the past 40 years. Okay, 10 times. That's not exact, but it's pretty close. So what we are spending every year, this one government is spending every month going all the way back 40 years. And I guarantee you 40 years ago, the IMB was not spending $300 million a year. So that's just to put in perspective how much the Saudi Arabian government is responsible for the spread of the most radical, violent, intolerant, terrorist. This is the group where the primary terrorists are coming from all over the world. And the primary fountain, the primary source is Saudi Arabia. Okay, so we just need to begin there. Okay, what about the Saudi influence on American media? Not just politics, but American media. Consider this. In 2004, so this is now 12 years ago, the jet-setting Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, he's probably the most famous Saudi prince. He's viewed as very Western friendly and all these sort of things. He, in a telethon that they had in Saudi Arabia, he donated $27 million to support the families of Palestinian suicide bombers. Palestinian suicide bombers. That's almost $30 million to support the killing of Jews in Israel, to support Palestinian suicide bombers. Now, the same prince, he is the largest shareholder in News Corp, which is the parent company of Fox News. Now, we could talk about this throughout the rest of the program, but listen, it should concern Americans that a guy who is clearly a supporter of terrorism, who donated $27 million, we know who donated $27 million to support Palestinian suicide bombing, is the largest shareholder in what is considered to be one of the most conservative and well-known, most watched news organizations in the entire country. Now, I'll just tell you a story. Taking a little bit of a risk by doing this, but let me just say this. In 2011, I was on Fox News with Glenn Beck, And I appreciate, I like Glenn Beck. Obviously I'm not a Mormon. I don't agree with, some of the peculiar doctrines of Joseph Smith, etc. But I really do value and love the guy and his contribution to the discourse. I think he has a great heart. And, I don't track with everything that he says or does. In fact, I rarely do, but I've met him. I really like him. Okay, that said, everyone always asks. So I was on with Glenn Beck. This is prime time when he was on Fox. I mean, he was at the top of his game, and he had me on, and we talked about Islam, Islamic eschatology, the radical eschatology regarding the Mahdi, and all of these things, and the Antichrist. I mean, this is unprecedented on mainstream news outlet, prime time. Here I am on Fox News talking about Islam and the Antichrist. It was gutsy. This was incredibly gutsy for Glenn Beck, and I applaud him for having me on. Now, before we went live, I looked at him and I said, listen, I apologize for whatever happens tomorrow. And he said, we're prepared, we've done all this stuff. But when I was with him, there was no talk of him leaving Fox News. It was just a few weeks later that it was announced that he was leaving Fox. And all my friends, of course, joke and they go, good job, Joel. You got Glenn Beck kicked off of Fox News. And I said, well, he invited me. But I always just thought it was a joke. I thought, well, maybe it might have been one of the straws that broke the camel's back. But it's interesting because, again, I have a high view of the sovereignty of God. I'm sitting in an airport in Nashville. It was about a year and a half ago. And I'm talking to this young family, and it turns out that they go to Gateway there down in Dallas. And Glenn Beck actually, I don't know if he still does, but he and his family were going to Gateway for a while. And it turns out this guy, as we're talking, he recognizes me. He says, oh, okay, yeah, you were on with Glenn Beck. Yeah, Joel Richardson. It's just a little airport. We start talking. And it turns out he knows Glenn Beck. And I said, I never really did hear why he got kicked off of Fox. And he said, that's interesting. He said, because I was just talking to Glenn last week. And he said, he told me that the reason he got kicked off is because of the Islamic majority ownership of Fox News, and that it was pressure from the Islamic ownership of Fox News that basically forced him out. And I said, you're kidding me. I always just kind of laughed and thought, well, maybe, maybe not. But here's the thing, guys. What if that's true? And I don't know that it's true. This is just, again, I'm hearing this secondhand from someone that says they talked to Glenn. Could it be true that, a news program that was really impacting the country, making an impact, speaking truth? I mean, he called it. He said there's going to be a caliphate. Now, granted, it hasn't panned out exactly the way that he envisioned of it taking over the whole world, but it's, he nailed it. And for what it's worth, he was reading a lot of my stuff. Okay, I'm not a I told you so guy, but he nailed it. And yet here was a guy that was speaking truth, doing his best, and he got pushed out of the company because the Saudis control a large percentage of Fox News. What if that's true? We don't talk about these things very often. Here's a statement by former retired CIA agent Robert Baer, and I encourage you to read his book. If you haven't read it, it's called Sleeping with the Devil. It's a little book. It's easy to read. Get it, read it. He says, any Washington bureaucrat with a room temperature IQ knows that if he stays on the right side of the kingdom some way or another, he'll be able to finagle his way to feed at the Saudi trough. A consulting contract with Aramco, a chair at the American University, a job with Lockheed, it doesn't matter. There's hardly a living former Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East, a CIA director, a White House staffer, or a member of Congress who hasn't ended up on the Saudi payroll in one way or another, or so it seems. Okay, guys, that's a huge statement. He's saying the Saudis have infiltrated every element of Washington, and they all know that if they kiss up to the Saudis, that when they retire, when they get out, they can feed at the trough. They can live easy. They can get a position on a consulting board, whatever, receive a few $100,000 a year and live good for the rest of their lives. Play ball, and you'll be taken care of. This is from a former CIA agent, Robert Baer, and I've come to really respect Baer's work, by the way. I don't agree with everything he says. I've come to really respect him. Here's another statement by Gerald Posner. Gerald is the author of a book called Secrets of the Kingdom, another excellent book. It's written back there, 2004, maybe 2003. And Posner says this. He says, Saudi Arabia acts much like any other country trying to cultivate U.S. support. Okay, we understand that. And he says they try to influence foreign policy on issues it considers important. But what makes the kingdom different from many other countries with similar ambitions is the power of money. It has succeeded on a scale unmatched by other countries. Okay. Saudi Arabia is unparalleled. How much so? How much so? One more statement. This is from a man named Laurent Morwish, or Morwick. I don't know how to pronounce it. He's French. He wrote a book called The Princes of Darkness, The Saudi Assault on the West. Another excellent book. He says this: Saudi Arabia, listen to this statement. Saudi Arabia buys politicians, government officials, journalists, academics, diplomats, colonels, generals, and intelligence officers. It buys experts at bargain prices, countless propagandists and lobbyists. When it sees fit, it demands the television programs be censored. It has flooded the circles of power with its petrodollars. It demands that American companies accept its political conditions in order to be able to do business, even in violation of the U.S. Constitution. And trust me, that's true. For years, you couldn't even enter the country of Saudi Arabia if you weren't Jewish. That didn't get lifted until about 10 years ago. And it was forbidden for us to do countries that had policies like that, but yet we did. Okay, so they've corrupted politicians, they've corrupted the media, they've corrupted all kinds of, every aspect of American culture and politics. What about the top office in the land? What about the top office in the land? According to the book Bearing False Witness, Jimmy Carter's Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. So this is a rebuke of Jimmy Carter's book that was titled Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. Here's a review. And this reviewer says this: Jimmy Carter's dependence on Arab funding stretches back to the early business connections in the 1970s and continues in the present with his multi-million-dollar donations to his richly endowed Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia. The center's 2006 annual report reveals total net assets of $412,393,757, a strikingly large figure for a nonprofit organization. Alan Dershowitz, the liberal Harvard lawyer, professor that I so appreciate, the author of the book, The Case for Israel, he said this. He says, Jimmy Carter has been bought off by millions of dollars in donations from Arab governments that refuses to recognize Israel and from Arab rulers who actively promote Jew hatred in the Middle East and elsewhere. A president has been bought off. This is what's being said. A president has been bought off with multiple millions of dollars by nations that are rabidly Jew haters. He goes on, he says, investigative journalists have revealed the extent to which Carter has been bought and paid for, quote, by the Arab and Islamic money. The Carter Center, a philanthropic foundation that the former president started after leaving office, has received donations in excess of $1 million from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the Sultanate of Oman, groups and individuals with close ties to these governments, including OPEC, the Saudi bin Laden group, as well as the late Saudi King Fahd, who was a founding member of the Carter organization, the Carter Center. The Saudi king was a founding member of our president's charitable organization. Listen, Carter went on to become one of the most rabid anti-Semites in recent history, and he was the highest level. Okay, so when you have a president who's a former Nobel laureate who's making clearly, derogatory statements toward Israel, and it was filled with factual errors, by the way. Numerous left-wing, right-wing groups pointed out that Jimmy Carter's book was an abomination, that he literally just made up stuff, he plagiarized stuff, and it was renounced. I mean, it resulted in like 15 of his board members resigning. It was so bad. Okay, so this is not just an issue, well, he's kind of leaning a little anti-Israel. No, this was rabid anti-Semitism, rabid disinformation, bought and paid for by the Saudi government. Is it just the left that the Saudis have bought? No, unfortunately, this thing has reached both sides. In his book, The House of Bush, House of Saud, the journalist Craig Unger writes this. He says, in all, now, so Carter received, let's say, several million, tens of millions. We're not sure how many he received. Over his lifetime, it was quite a bit. The Bushes left him in the dust. Unger says this, in all, at least basically $1.5 billion had made its way from the Saudis to the House of Bush and its allied companies and institutions. It could safely be said that never before in history had a presidential candidate, much less a presidential candidate and his father, a former president, been so closely tied financially and personally to the ruling family of another foreign power. Never before had a president's personal fortunes and public policies been so deeply entwined with another nation. Now, listen, I voted for Bush. I was a supporter of Bush. What happened on 9/11? The entire airfield was grounded. No one was allowed in the air, except for some leading American politicians. No, except for Saudi princes, Saudi royals. The only planes in the air on 9/11 and even for the next 2 days were the Saudis. Can you imagine living with that level of prestige, with that level of special treatment, that you were the only exception in the most powerful nation in the world because of the amount of influence that you have over the presidency, over the president and his father and that family? Listen, $1.476, $1.5 billion. That's 1,500 times a million. $1 million, 1,500 times in one family's. And you think that doesn't affect? You think that doesn't affect the way they govern, the way they relate to the Saudis? Of course it does. Of course it does. Now, here we are, 2016. Bill Clinton's got out. The Bushes were pretty good at hiding it. It required a lot of journalistic, detective work to try to get that number. And a lot of people say it's probably, again, double that. It's probably more like 3 billion, but this is the amount that they could see. With the Clintons, on the other hand, they're just open about it. They're pretty brazen. And so this is from an article in the Daily Caller. It says, Bill and Hillary Clinton received at least 100 million from autocratic Persian Gulf states and their leaders, potentially undermining Democratic presidential candidate Hillary's claim she can carry out independent Middle East policies. As a presidential candidate, the amount of foreign cash the Clintons have amassed from the Persian Gulf is unprecedented. Of course, that's not true, because with the Bushes, it was far greater. And this is according to a national security analyst, Patrick Poole. The statistics specifically from the Saudis for the Clintons, it was roughly $33 million. Listen to me, friends. $33 million gets you what you want. This is not, the Saudis are not just giving money because they believe in the Clinton Foundation, because they're just great humanitarians. They expect a return to their investments. You look at all of the terrorism. You look at what's taking place all across Europe, in the United States, in Africa with Boko Haram, in Somalia, in Nigeria, in Syria, and Iraq. You look at this mess, that falls right at the feet of the Saudi royals. We cannot have a president any longer doing business and being in bed and being financially blackmailed by these people. This is one of the looming issues with regard to this election. Friends, we need to have discernment. We need to be aware of what's unfolding in the earth. And so I'll just end with these last two verses from the book of Revelation and just ask you to be prayerful. Revelation 17, verse 18. The woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. The amount of money that we're talking about, there is no global bank that has given the Bushes $3 billion. There's no lobby in Washington that even begins to compare to the amount of money that the Saudis are pouring directly into the back pockets of American presidents, political leaders all across the boards. There is nothing that compares. Revelation 18, verse 9, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with the great harlot. This is the language of Revelation. I'm going to get back into this issue. I just want to leave you with this. This is all the time that we have for this week. I want to thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.